Rich people in the Middle Ages liked to show off their wealth in much the same way as rich people today, by buying ludicrously expensive items that they probably didn't need and then loudly proclaiming that they bought them. To put it another way, they loved to spend money on fashion. Now, while we may look back at some of the fashions of the period and laugh, like at those big puffy sleeves that look like bat wings, or those giant hats that covered the wearer's entire face, or those pointy shoes, they were really quite serious about their footwear. Those fashions were very much in vogue, as it were. And those who wore them wanted to be seen wearing them. After all, there was a reason that they paid so much for them. You see, if you were a rich medieval peasant, noble, there was a lot of pressure to look the part. After all, if you couldn't afford to look good, how could you expect others to take you seriously? That is a rhetorical question. The answer is obviously you couldn't. There was no department store in those days, no mall. So nobles relied on traveling merchants or their own servants to purchase their goods. Since they rarely saw the items they were purchasing for themselves until they received them, they had to rely on the integrity of the salespeople, which was about as risky as putting your credit card number in an email to someone who claimed they were from Microsoft, and that your computer was about to explode unless you sent them $300. The most common scam, according to records from the time, was for merchants to sell shoddy goods and then claim that that was how the nobility dressed. So, if the noble was wearing a hat that covered his face, the last thing he would want is for someone to come along and say, "Hey, that hat doesn't look right." He would just assume that the person was mistaken and continue on his merry way, completely unaware that he was actually looking like a fool. A 15th century merchant named Benedetto recounted such an instance when he and his brother were traveling through France and encountered a knight whose entire face was covered by a black silk hat. When Benedetto inquired as to whether that was the current fashion in Paris, the knight replied that it most certainly was. And indeed, when Benedetto entered the city, he saw that many of the higher on the societal rungs were following the trend. Benedetto himself was not immune to the desire to blend in, so he purchased a similarly sized hat for himself. However, upon returning to Italy, he learned that his hat was far too big to be in fashion there. It seemed that the French nobles had been duped into buying overpriced face hats based on a misrepresentation by traveling merchants. Benedetto was not amused. Of course, not everyone fell for the tricks of the traveling salesman. One noblewoman named Isabella of Bavaria noticed that her neighbors were wearing these silly hats and asked her husband to please make sure she wasn't being left out of the latest fashion. He obliged by having 2 hats made for her, each one slightly smaller than the last. She wore the smallest one around the house and saved the larger ones for when she went out. Eventually, though, the hats went out of style and Isabella was free to go back to wearing whatever she pleased. Sometimes, though, what she pleased to wear did not please the general populace. Once she donned a dress so revealing that the bishop felt compelled to write her a strongly worded letter, complaining about the length of her skirt. Isabella was unrepentant, though, and kept wearing the dress. You know what? More power to her. When you think of a medieval feast, you probably imagine flagons of ale, roasted boar, mountains of bread. In reality, you might have eaten some of that. But what you ate depended heavily on when you ate it and how much money you had. A poor peasant would eat whatever they could, whenever they could. A wealthy noble would eat very specifically when they were supposed to. Meals were carefully planned out for them and served at precisely the right times, 3 squares a day, plus snacks. Medieval people believed that eating too much between meals caused illness. So, nobles wouldn't touch a morsel until their next appointed snack time. And what those snacks consisted of changed depending on the season. Spring meant asparagus. Summer was for cherries and fruit. Autumn brought nuts and wintertime treats like peas pudding, and yes, that was a thing. But it wasn't just about what you ate. How you ate it mattered too. In fact, it mattered a lot. The way a meal was prepared, served, and eaten told others how important you were. The higher up you were on the social rungs, the more likely your food was to be made by servants, presented on gold plates and cut by a special knife. The lower you were on the social scale, the more likely you were to cut your own bread with a dull knife and pass your plate directly to your mouth. Of course, this didn't mean you couldn't enjoy delicious food if you were poor. There were plenty of tasty local specialties for everyone to enjoy. In France, peasants and nobles alike might dig into a coq au vin, a hearty chicken stew. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, a British peasant might munch on a dish of baked eels, while the king enjoyed a venison pie. If you had money, you could afford spices like pepper and ginger. These were expensive imports. And if you were super rich, you could even hire a personal chef. Yep, even back then, money really does buy you flavor. Okay, so you survived the food, you endured the endless parties, you put up with the lack of privacy. Maybe it's time to take a deep breath, lean back and sip that mead, right? Wrong. Being rich in the Middle Ages meant living under a constant cloud of fear. Castles might look like fun fairy tales, but they were built to keep you inside and the bad guys out, which means you rarely left your property, ever. It wasn't exactly easy to pop over to the market for some fresh fruit or trot into town to see a movie. Not that any of those things existed, but you get the point. If you wanted to go anywhere, you needed a very good reason and a lot of armed guards. Life was dangerous for everyone, but it was especially perilous for the rich. You weren't just targeted by bandits or highwaymen looking for a bit of quick cash. You were often in the crosshairs of other nobles who simply wanted your stuff. Jealousy and greed were common motivators. So if you were rich, you were constantly surrounded by soldiers and bodyguards. The front gate of your castle was always shut tight, and you never showed up to parties without bringing a few dozen men along. Sometimes these precautions weren't enough, and the cost of defending your life and land could be astronomical. During the 100 Years' War, one English lord spent more than £20,000 on a single siege. And that amount of money would be enough to employ an entire army for an entire year. Plus, no matter how many locks you had on your doors, how high you built your walls, nothing could protect you from one fate worse than all the others, being bombed. Medieval cities weren't exactly known for their urban planning. In fact, they stunk. Waste piled up in the streets, neighbors shared walls, houses were packed together. And when one caught fire, it was like throwing a match into a tinderbox. Rich folks tried to prevent these fires by creating dedicated fire brigades. But a well-trained team of firefighters could only do so much. When disaster struck, the wealthy ran the risk of losing everything they owned in a single afternoon. So, yeah, being rich in the Middle Ages meant being terrified all the time. Maybe you were born into the right family and can trace your lineage all the way back to Charlemagne himself. Congrats. Unfortunately, your royal bloodline also means that you'll spend your whole life answering to kings, queens, popes, emperors. Basically, everyone who is higher up on the food chain than you is going to want something from you. And if you say no, they might take what they want anyway. Welcome to feudalism. Unless you paid a king or queen a hefty sum of money to protect you, you were essentially responsible for defending your own land. And your best chance at winning a battle was having more money and more men than your opponent. Your soldiers owed you loyalty, but they could also be bought off by someone who was offering more gold. Landowners with deep pockets were constantly trying to add to their wealth and influence. So they formed alliances, built monuments and lavished ridiculous amounts of money on the church. That way, God would be on their side too. Everyone else had to fall in line behind them. If you were rich, your word was law in your land. You could set the tax rate, demand extra work from your serfs, and make life miserable for anyone who could then pay the fees that you set. To be rich in the Middle Ages was to be feared. Ah, the medieval feast. A dazzling display of wealth, power, and gastronomy, or so they tell you. In reality, if you were rich in medieval times, every meal was a political performance. It wasn't about enjoying food. It was about surviving it. Picture this, you're seated at a long, drafty table with dozens of other nobles, all pretending they're having a wonderful time. Musicians play badly tuned lutes. A jester tells jokes no one laughs at. And the food, oh boy, you'd think the wealthy ate better than everyone else. Well, yes and no, rich folks didn't eat fresh fruits and vegetables. That was peasant food. No, sir, not for them. They dined on overcooked meat drowning in spicy sauces. Why? Because the meat was often slightly, shall we say, questionable? Spoiled, maybe, but if you dump enough cinnamon, cloves, and pepper on it, no one notices. or they just pretend not to notice. Also, forks were considered suspicious. You were expected to eat with your hands, elegantly, of course. Try gracefully tearing apart a greasy pheasant leg in front of a room, full of judgmental nobles while balancing a goblet in your other hand. One wrong move, and someone writes a poem about your terrible manners that lasts for centuries. Imagine the Twitter thread. Then there were the centerpieces, peacocks redressed in their own feathers, entire castles made of sugar. Or, and this is worse, live animals baked into pies, ready to fly out and terrify your guests. It was less about appetite and more about shock value. But the worst part of being a rich diner, the performance never ends. You must laugh at the right jokes, nod at the right bishop, and never, ever show that your stomach is churning from the questionable eel pie. Even a single burp could offend the wrong person and cause a scandal that ripples through the court like a poisoned rumor. Your seat at the table wasn't just a place to dine, it was a status symbol. And your every move was scrutinized by your peers, your rivals, and those scheming nobles who write poems about your table manners. At a feast, you weren't just eating food, you were performing. Eating was a high-stakes game where the smallest misstep could have consequences that spread faster than a plague through a crowded city. So what did you actually eat during a medieval feast? For starters, don't expect a balanced diet. This wasn't the time for health food. Medieval meals were heavy on meat, often served with questionable side dishes. Venison, peacock, swan, even whale meat made an appearance on rich people's tables. Fruits and vegetables were considered too peasant-like unless, of course, they could be exotic. Think pomegranates, ginger, and, above all, spices. Cinnamon, cloves, and pepper were not just for flavor, they were for concealing the not-so-freshness of certain meats. Sauces played a crucial role in the medieval dining experience. Why? Well, besides adding flavor to that questionable meat, sauces also helped disguise its texture. A rich person might order a sauce on the side, discreetly pour it over their questionable meat, and then send the sauce-covered dish back to the kitchen. What was that sauce made of? Usually a combination of wine, vinegar, spices, and sometimes ground small bones or gristle from the preparation. It was uncommon for cooks to use these ingredients to make the broth or stock in which the meat was cooked. This way, any errors in the main dish would be camouflaged by the sauce. Talk about a do-it-all condiment. Now let's talk about the centerpiece, usually some sort of elaborate pastry. These weren't your average apple pies. We're talking about hunting scenes, religious iconography, and even tiny figures engaged in battle. Some centerpieces were designed to be as theatrical as possible. Remember those live animals baked inside pies? Yep, they were often released during the meal to roam around the table and fly away. Imagine that. You're trying to enjoy your questionable meat when suddenly a live pigeon flies past your head. It was meant to be a spectacle, a show of wealth and culinary skill. So what was the purpose of a medieval feast anyway? Well, imagine a combination of a royal banquet and a job interview. You're not just eating, you're being watched. The meal is a chance for nobles to solidify alliances, exchange gifts, and most importantly, show off their status. Every dish, every ingredient, every beautifully crafted morsel is a declaration of wealth and power. It's a silent, delicious shout to the world that says, "Look how much money I have." In the end, surviving a medieval feast wasn't just about consuming food. It was about enduring an experience, navigating a minefield of etiquette rules, hidden meanings, and potential disasters. It was a test of endurance, a trial by cuisine. Now excuse me while I go puke. Being rich in medieval times was not all it was cracked up to be. If you had enough money, you didn't have to get your hands dirty or worry about where your next meal was coming from. Instead, you could spend your days hunting, playing games, and scheming about how to acquire even more wealth. Sounds pretty sweet, right? Well, there was a price to pay for living that cushy lifestyle. And no, we're not talking about taxes. Now let's peek behind the velvet curtains and talk about servants. You'd think being rich meant you could finally relax while someone else did all the work. But in medieval times, having servants just meant you had more people watching you and reporting every sneeze. First, forget privacy. Rich people were basically medieval celebrities. They were followed everywhere by a cast of handmaidens. Chamberlains, cupbearers, tutors, and gentlemen with far too much free time and way too many opinions. Your chambermaid knew your favorite perfume. Your barber knew how many gray hairs you had. Your steward knew how much money you were hiding. And guess what? Most of them talked to each other, to rivals, to that nosy lady from the next manor over. And let's not forget who was paying them. If you treated your servants poorly, word got around, and pretty soon you couldn't hire anyone. Ever. A lord might start off with the best intentions, but after years of hearing his servants' snarky comments about his wife's new gown or how much weight he gained, those barbs can start to wear on him. Before he knows it, he's shouting at the poor guy to get out, and that was the best case scenario. Sometimes servants took secrets to their grave, literally. These days, we have laws protecting whistleblowers. Back then, someone could blackmail you for something you said in confidence. But even if you didn't slip up, your servants could still betray you. Sometimes they were spies planted by your enemies or even your family. Your cousin might slip a few coins to your cook, hoping to find out whether you've been writing letters to his wife or whether you've gained weight or, what you muttered after too much wine at dinner. When you went to war, you might entrust a family member or a close friend with managing your estate. But even their loyalty could be bought. Your steward oversaw everything from crops to livestock to how much charity was given to beggars at the gate. And sure, he was honest with you most of the time, but an offer of land or gold from your rival and suddenly feeding intelligence to the enemy. But you'd be surprised what people will listen to. A foot soldier might mock his captain's orders, but when that same order comes down from the king, he takes it seriously. In medieval times, a king's word was law. You wouldn't believe what people would risk for a bit of gossip. Let's say you were hosting a party and you hired an extra serving girl for the night. Next thing you know, the whole town is buzzing about how you flirted with that new kitchen maid, even though she's 12 years old. Yeah, it happens. Or maybe you spilled state secrets to a trusted advisor while drinking. Wine, because you thought the walls had ears. Well, a page or apprentice might hear the whole thing and repeat it to the king, word for word. Suddenly, you're summoned to the throne room and the king wants answers. Problem is, you don't remember exactly what you told him. Oops, it wasn't uncommon for servants to accidentally overhear things, especially secrets. Especially when nobles whispered things they shouldn't about land or alliances or romantic flings. Servants soaked up gossip like stale bread in gravy, and that gossip could ruin you faster than a sword. One poorly timed joke and suddenly the local bishop thinks you're possessed, or imagine you caught a fever. Your servants nursed you back to health, but now everyone in town knows you had a fever, that you were sweating and delirious and muttering nonsense. Thanks a lot. And unfortunately, your bedchamber wasn't safe either. You'd think getting ready for bed would be the quietest part of your day, but it was actually pretty hectic. Someone had to stoke the fire, someone else had to help you dress. Someone had to stand by in case you wanted a drink or a bedtime prayer. That's at least 3 people in your room while you're trying to pee. So, yeah, being rich meant you were surrounded by staff. But it also meant you were never, ever. For more medieval mishaps, including a royal pig assassination, check out the series in the description below. So you finally made it. Your hard work has paid off and now you're rich. Congratulations, you must be so happy. Wait, are those shackles? Is that a hooded figure dragging you towards an altar? Oh, right, of course. Being rich doesn't mean you get to skip the sacrifices to the gods. Well, here goes nothing. Welcome to life in the medieval world, where if you thought being rich meant safety and security, you'd be sorely mistaken. In fact, the higher you rose in society, the harder and bloodier you could fall. So how exactly did the medieval ruling class live on the edge? Let's find out. Let's start with court politics. Back in the day, the king was like the CEO of the entire kingdom. And just like today, you didn't get to that position by being a softie. Kings ruled through a combination of charm, threats, alliances, and betrayals. And as a member of the nobility, you were expected to play the game. Too bad you didn't choose this career path, you were born into it. If your family had enough money and influence, you were expected to attend royal court. Learn the rules of the game and bring your charming, threatening, backstabbing A game. Every smile at court was a hidden dagger. Every nod at a feast was a potential alliance or a future betrayal. One wrong alliance and your lands could be seized. One awkward joke and suddenly you're accused of treason. Even attending the wrong wedding could land you in a dungeon. And the worst part, you couldn't sit out of the game. You had to play constantly. But let's say you managed to survive court politics. Did you really think you were safe? Not a chance. Next up was poison. Seriously, when it comes to medieval rich people, you can't be too careful. They were terrified of being poisoned. We're talking about some serious paranoia here. Meals were tested. Wine was sipped by servants first. Sorry, Thomas. Kitchen staff were watched more closely than the royal treasury. And there were even entire job titles for food tasters whose career goals were basically survive dinner, why all the fear? Because poison was the medieval rich person's weapon of choice. Swords were messy, accidents were suspicious. But poison was the perfect tool. It could make death look natural, mysterious, or perfectly timed. And since no one understood science back then, a little stomach ache could easily be passed off as divine punishment or bad air. Even if you weren't poisoned, you were still vulnerable to rumors. People accused each other of sorcery, adultery, blasphemy, and everyone's favorite conspiring against the king. Nobles vanished overnight. Some reappeared in exile. Some never reappeared at all. And let's not forget the pressure. Pressure to produce heirs, pressure to maintain your estates, pressure to look perfect, act perfect, and never show weakness. Basically, being rich was like living in a gilded cage. And that cage had no lock because you were expected to stay in it willingly. So does this mean the medieval poor had it so much better? Not at all. Check out the next video to find out why being poor in the Middle Ages was actually pretty awesome. You've made it. After years of backstabbing, scheming, and elbowing your way to the top, you're finally rich. Congratulations. Now prepare to have every waking moment of your life ruined. Welcome to medieval life. Where's the nearest bathroom? Quick disclaimer before we begin. This video isn't meant to glamorize or encourage any form of violence. We're just saying that sometimes revolution does seem like an option. You may think that being rich was the ultimate goal, but now that you're wealthy, you realize that there are downsides. Let's start with the good news. You will never have to make a 12-hour workday building a wall ever again. Unless you secretly love making 12-hour workdays building walls, in which case, maybe go back to being poor. That was the perk of being poor. You were so busy trying not to starve to death that you didn't have time to contemplate how awful your life was. But now that you're rich, you do have time for that. Next bit of good news. Servants, hooray, now you can afford servants. Which means that for the first time in your life, someone will be around to hand you a towel after a bath. But that's about the only benefit because being waited on hand and foot by people whose lives are miserable and who resent you for being able to afford them is pretty depressing. Also, those servants. They might be plotting to murder you, given half a chance. Or perhaps the one you trusted to give you that back rub has slipped poison into your wine. Who am I kidding? It's probably the wife you pushed out the window. And then there's your new home, a palace that's constantly cold and drafty, cobwebs everywhere, rampant mold, questionable stains, and you want to keep your windows shut at night. Because nothing says burglar magnet quite like a room full of valuables and servants who resent you, and then the pests. The roaches will swarm, the rats will breed, and at least in theory you can get rid of them. But what about fleas? Good luck convincing these little bloodsuckers to move elsewhere. The Black Death may have been the most famous plague to hit medieval Europe, but it was far from the only one. Typhoid, cholera, leprosy, the sweating sickness. Oh boy, do you feel that chill down your spine? Just be glad you aren't up to your scabrous elbows in dead rats, or are you? Ooh, what's that smell? Is that the fishmonger you hired to clean the fish? Well, never mind. At least you won't die of starvation. Being rich meant you could afford food. Sometimes too much food, which brought its own problems. Peasants ate mostly vegetables and grain, plus the occasional luxury of cheese or eggs. Rich people ate better, lots of roasted meats, rich sauces, sweets. And as a result, rich people were fatter and unhealthier than their poorer neighbors. And the things that made them fat and unhealthy also made them ugly. Remember that bag of sweets you had for breakfast? Yeah, it's caked on your teeth. Don't bother brushing them. Those moldering things between your teeth aren't going anywhere. Those fancy candied fruits you love so much? They're destroying your molars. As a result, medieval nobility had some of the worst teeth in the world. To top it off, there weren't even any good dentists around to pull out your pus-filled abscesses. Those folks had gone to see the executioner instead. But there were worse afflictions than bad teeth. Ever played a sport and felt a sharp pain in your knee, that awful moment when you knew you'd done something serious? Now imagine that feeling except it's in your toe and it never goes away. That's gout, a disease brought on by eating too much meat and sugar. It's a rich man's disease and it hurts like hell. The biggest problem with being rich, though, was that once you were rich, you couldn't afford to stop being rich. For a peasant, life was hard, but it was predictable. The best way to describe medieval peasantry is, peasants did not have a lot of options, but for a rich person, the stakes were higher. If the crop failed, you'd have to dip into your reserves. If the workers revolted, you'd have to call the militia. If your rival sent an assassin, you'd have to jump out of a window. If your son fell in love with a woman your daughter's age, you'd have to murder him. A small price to pay for love, but a big price to pay for sanity. As a result, the rich were prisoners in their gilded cages. They couldn't enjoy their wealth, afraid that doing so would bring ruin upon themselves and their family. Their clothes were stiff, their manners were curt-fropped, their food was bland, their servants were plotting to kill them, and they had to spend all their time watching out for enemies, both real and imagined. In the end, being rich in medieval times meant that you had to pretend that you were happy all the time. Oh, go pick flowers with your 5 newlywed daughters without a care in the world. Don't talk to me about being born in the wrong era. Just let me finish my 5-pound bag of catnip, then I'll go watch someone else get murdered. For more on the perks of poverty, check out Why Being Poor in Medieval Times Was Better Than Being Rich, or watch Living in a Medieval Castle. For an even more claustrophobic look at medieval life,